let us know if you can't. Okay,
Nice.
kick off. So, this is me. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Yes, I'm very proud to be owner and founder of SL Therapy London. I've only been running 4 years. It seems like a lot longer in a great way. And we do a lot of work, as was mentioned. So we can just kick off with what we're going to do today. So everything today is referenced and is taken from the Maggie Johnson Selective Mutism Resource Manual. This is the book if you're working with a child with selective mutism. It's an absolute tomb of resource. And it covers everything from what we assessment all the way through to transition. So what I've done is I've kind of taken some key bits of information from this big resource and put it into this presentation today, and we're going to talk around those different topics. So if you have a copy of the manual or you're thinking about purchasing it, this again will help signpost you to what the child you're working with specifically needs, because it's very general, it covers everything. It's absolutely brilliant. So we're going to do what is selective mutism. I'm going to talk about the assessment process, then what the diagnosis means, and then selective mutism versus reluctant speakers, what the difference is, treatment, how do you treat it, how to manage it, ensuring anxiety-free environment and transitions. Please, can everybody mute themselves?
Oh, you're on mute, Sarah.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, right. So that's what we're going to cover today. So what is selective mutism? It is defined as a consistent failure to speak in specific social situations. So really it should be called situational mutism, okay, because really it's the anxiety of speaking in certain situations, so it's situational. The reason it's called selective mutism is because that is the medical the medical definition of what selective mutism is, because it's selective. It's more a medical word, but really that's not very helpful, is it, when working with children with selective mutism, because it does bring up all those ridiculous ideas that some people have about children with selective mutism. But if you said situational mutism, straight away, doesn't it, it changes the thought process and the thinking about that child. Okay, so I'm calling it selective mutism today because that's the medical definition, but when I'm working with a family or a school, I'll always use the term situational mutism. So it is an anxiety disorder, okay? It's an anxiety of speaking in certain situations. The child can speak a little or not at all, and then in other situations they can talk freely. It is a predictable pattern. It must have persisted for at least a month, all right? And bear in mind that no children with selective mutism are the same. I hold quite a large clinical caseload of selective mutism children and adults, and absolutely no two are the same. So it's more common than previously thought. The Maggie Johnson references that up to 7 children per 1,000 are affected. So if you are a teacher or a SENCO on this presentation, there'll be at least one child in your school. I was in a school where there were actually 2 in one class, which is actually quite unusual, but led to some interesting selective mutism group work as we developed their treatment. So yes, more than one plus children in most primary schools will have selective mutism. And girls are affected at least as frequently as boys, if not more. Quite interesting to note. So, a child who has selective mutism is more likely to have other family members who are shy or anxious and have difficulty with social relationships. The pattern of the speaking and the silence, as we call it, is different for every child, but it is consistent and predictable. So common misconceptions, all of these things I have heard by professionals, other family members, when talking about a child with selective mutism. She's very controlling. How does he manage to keep it quiet for so long? She must have great willpower. She is so stubborn. These are just a few, and these are the polite ones that I've put down. So in my very professional way, I've then tried to tell them what it actually means. Yeah, I put it in red, just highlight it. So I then retort when I get these comments of saying that it's a phobia, okay? It is an anxiety disorder and it can be overcome, all right? The first step is to talk about it and understanding it. Applying the pressure, in this case to speak, will make the phobia of talking worse. Gradually facing the fears is the key to success, and the confidence will then have a ripple effect. So there are three elements that contribute to the fear conditioning. So when I'm working with a family or a school or a nursery, this is what we discuss. One, it can be a sensitive personality. This could be a combination of genetic and psychological factors, which would make that child or young person already vulnerable to develop an anxiety disorder. It can be life events. So is there a link between the need to talk and intense anxiety? Has an event happened in their life that has triggered this? And then there's the maintenance behaviour. So the reactions of the other people that reinforces and then strengthens the child's belief that actually talking now would be too difficult, too stressful, and is best to be avoided. Then we come to the assessment part of it. How do we assess for a child who's got situational mutism? So in the UK, speech and language therapists provide the official diagnosis. Don't delay, but also don't rush in. It can seem quite contradictory with the assessment and treatment. You must seek the advice of a speech and language therapist after, and it can happen at the same time. Lots of families I work with, this all kind of goes at the same time. They seek my advice and then we have a discussion with parents and education staff. Observations have been carried out, so if there's a nursery or school setting, the SENCO or the class teacher will have made observations about the child, maybe at playtime, lunchtime, in the classroom. When are they talking, when they're not talking? And then typically you'd want to wait 2 months after a child has started school or nursery, okay, just to let them settle in, because a lot of children, especially when they're bilingual as well, there can be a delay with their development of language, especially if English is a second language. So waiting that 2-month period kind of leaves that exploratory period to see what it looks like it could be. So then after 2 months, you've got your observations, you've discussed it with parents, you've discussed it with staff, and then you speak with a speech and language therapist to bring it all together, okay? Assessment for selective mutism is very different and very specialist compared to a typical speech and language assessment. Again, I know it's our professional title, speech and language therapist, but I find it can be really misleading because speech and language brings up connotations. I've had it of elocution and of stammering, whereas if you were to say a communication therapist, it kind of opens up the field, doesn't it? And understanding can be a bit easier sometimes. But it's the speech and language therapist that will assess and will diagnose the selective mutism. And it can be largely eradicated if detected early and managed appropriately. I would also, because this is my purpose of today, is to empower you as well. If you do have a speech and language therapist who is coming in to assess, selective mutism is really specialist. So I have been trained by Maggie Johnson, who wrote the resource manual and is a deity in the selective mutism world. So I would be asking the question, if a speech therapist come in, what is your training for selective mutism? How many children have you worked with selective mutism, and what therapy, what treatment have you done with them? Because like I said, it is very specialist. Or highly specialist actually, or even if they haven't got the training themselves, do they have, if it's an NHS department, a supervisor or a mentor who is guiding them through it, who is specialist in selective mutism? But then if it was that case, I'd be asking for that specialist to come in and assess. But anyway, we can discuss that in the questions afterwards. So yes, always make sure the speech and language therapist that you have in front of you when discussing a child with selective mutism has training and has experience, because it's highly specialist. If that's what you take away from today, then that'd be really great. So when you assess, again, very different from working with a child who might have autism or might have just delayed language and articulation speech work. Sometimes the work that I do is mainly online, lockdown for my caseload has actually been quite positive in many ways. Because they have an anxiety around talking and coming in as a new person, that's going to heighten the anxiety. So online assessments work really well. When I meet with the parents, we'll talk about the case history, the journey so far. Okay, why are they meeting with me? Looking at the pattern of the child's speaking habits. So we kind of do a location mapping and conversational mapping. Conversational partners, who are they engaging with and where? And then what voice they're using. Are they using their voice, quiet voice, non-verbal, tapping, gesture? And I call it mapping. We can really map it out. Okay. Then we talk about, I'd meet with the school or the education setting and do the same there. So you've got a really clear mapping of how this child's presenting in different situations, because then you can see where the treatment needs to take place. If appropriate, you can do a speech, language and cognitive profile of the child, and then also look at their emotional and social profile as well. When I do online assessments, the parents will turn off the camera and play with the child or talk with the child in the room, and I might be on an iPad just propped up against the fridge. But that's a really good way to gain a language and communication sample of the child's typical speech when they're relaxed and when they're talking. Again, as well, when you meet with the educational setting, you have all the observations, the marks and assessments that they've done as well. So it's a very much an exploratory assessment, and most of the time isn't as direct as it may seem when you see another speech therapist do a communication assessment. Okay. Again, the Maggie Johnson resource manual goes into a lot more detail about this, but I just wanted you to have some clear bullet points of what you would expect to happen and what should be happening when the assessment takes place. We'd also be talking about traumatic events in that child's life. You know, has anything happened which to us as adults might seem minor, but to them is huge. One child I worked with, they'd moved house, and that had triggered it. A grandparent dying, loss of a pet, a new child, a new sibling. So it's very exploratory, the assessment. But again, it's about gaining all that information about that child's life and what's going on in it at the minute. So then you have situational mutism versus reluctant speakers. So general discomfort in unfamiliar or group situations, so they could just feel shy and overwhelmed. It might be the complexity of the language used, which might make them reluctant to speak, which might be a red flag for language difficulties. They could just have a lack of confidence in expressive language skills, which would red flag to expressive language difficulties, or it might be their personality style of conversational partner. Again, in the Maggie Johnson resource manual, there's a really clear kind of flow chart that I always sit with parents and I do an assessment, and it comes out together what it might be through a mixture of yes or no questions. Selective mutism versus reluctant speaker, and it's just another useful tool to use with parents and school to explain the process and how the child is presenting. Again, it could be fear of consequences or then lack of interest in social interaction, which would red flag social communication difficulties. So, selective mutism can occur with other difficulties such as autism, separation anxiety, other phobias like eating in public, or generalised anxiety as well. As you can imagine, with lockdown and COVID as well, there has been a lot of heightened anxiety as well. So it's very common that selective mutism would co-occur with other difficulties. So you may be working with a child who would have a dual diagnosis. So then we come on to the treatment of it. So if you assess the child, you've done the flow chart, you've done the conversational location mapping, you've gained a sample of typical speech and language, and there's no concerns cognitively, no concerns with their language, communication skills, they are interacting with peers, but it might be non-verbal. So then we come to treatment. The most important thing to note is that treatment must take place in the setting where the child is not talking. I was involved with the child. The child was talking very freely at home to grandparents, to parents, extended family members, but was not talking in school, was actually wetting themselves and not eating lunch because they were so anxious about talking in school. And it was very difficult with this particular school to gain access into and carry out the treatment, or indeed support with setting it up. That is one example. So we were unable to proceed because the treatment needed to take place where the child's not talking. But there are many, many, many successful, wonderful stories of educational settings that I've worked in where it's been brilliant. We've had a quiet room, we've had key workers, we've had training, and it just works. It absolutely does. The treatment is evidence-based, and it just does. So good teamwork is absolutely essential. If the advice and guidance is followed, speech with 1 or 2 key people can be established within 2 months. But reaching fully effective communication with all people in all situations can take longer, which of course will depend on a range of factors. You know, if they're in year 6 and about to move to secondary school, then that could delay the process, how long they've had it. So a child who is 4 with selective mutism versus a child who is 14, and the competence of the team. So making sure the team is very clear of the goals, what they're doing, and working together. So to effectively managing it, early identification, of course, with anything is key, as we know. Effective management involves the child, the family, and the teaching staff. Eliminating those maintaining factors. So looking at what's happened so far that might be maintaining that child's anxiety of talking, and then introducing the behavioural programme of desensitization and graded exposure. It's very much think about it like if you were scared of, it's like phobias, isn't it? So of a spider, if you were scared of a spider and I came up to you and put one in your hand, it would probably, you'd scream, your body would freeze, you would become really, really anxious. If you started with graded exposure, I showed you a photo, then I showed you a cuddly toy, then we looked at one on a TV, then we saw one in a cage, in a in a container. And then maybe you looked at it through there, touched it through the glass. That is going to be a graded exposure to a phobia that would lead to a positive outcome of hopefully one day be able to hold the spider because we've done all that work together. Okay, that's the same what we're doing here in the most barest example. But I do use that when I'm working with parents and teachers because it's a really clear way of understanding this is the work we're doing and this is what it's going to look like. So it's really key. A lot of the management and the treatment is 99% setting up the environment, the staff and the session. And then I always say like 1 or 2% is the actual session that you're doing. If we haven't got all the factors in place, then there's absolutely no point of doing the session. So you've got to appoint a member of staff to make a special relationship with that child or young person on a one-to-one basis, just so they know they have that support. Again, this is very different when you're working with a child who might have language difficulties. I know one school I was working at said, oh, it's brilliant. We've got two to 3 TAs and we're going to mix them up with her throughout the week. And I literally just went, no, that's the worst thing you can do. This child needs consistency. It's about a phobia. It's anxiety of talking. You've got to build up that special rapport. So again, it's about learning and understanding how this is a very different approach to working with the child with selective mutism. Actively support the development of friendships and inclusion in pastoral activities. Always just be really patient and never pressurise the child, young person to speak. And then you continue to support and monitor progress until the child speaks freely and independently. So we call it confident speaking, and this would be, if you were working with me, would be on the treatment plan. So the aim of it is the ability to talk, spelling mistake, with a range of people in a range of places, both one-to-one and in larger groups, to meet all conversational needs without undue fear of negative judgment. So you must look at the factors in the environment which may be maintaining the silence. So there are 10 stages of confident speaking. 1 is no communication at all. 2 is where the child will cooperate, but there's absolutely no sounds, there's no vocal or verbal communication. 3 is non-vocal communication, so that might be tapping or pointing, so they are trying to communicate. Number 4 is non-verbal sounds. That might be like clicks with the mouth. 5 is then speaking within earshot of the new person. 6 will be using single words with the new person. 7 is sentences, and then 8 you extend it to speaking with new people. 9 is then location, so speaking in different places, and then 10 is speaking fully and freely. When I work with parents in schools, I'll always show this to them as part of the assessment process and say, where do you think the child is functioning now? That's the stage we'll start at, and then it's a really good indicator to come back and see every half term or however long you're managing at the school, the child is progressing. Okay, so 10 stages. So the old classic, which is evidence-based and does work. I have done this so many times, and when it is done properly, it is completely effective. If it is not done properly, as I'm going to lay out to you, it will not work. it just won't. So what does sliding in mean? It's to help young children or young adults talk to familiar adults without anxiety at their own pace. Okay, depending on the child's initial anxiety level, so looking at those 10 stages, depending on where they are when you first start, it could take 1 session, it could take 2 to 3 weeks. Clinically, in my experience with the children and young people I've worked in, you're looking at between 3 to 6, normally 3 to 4 weeks. What it's doing, so you're enabling the child to gradually tolerate being overheard and spoken to by a completely new person. The idea is the new person slides into the child's comfort zone. So the idea is you would need a quiet room. Say the child's not talking at school. So I would say we need a quiet space that you're going to have mum or dad, if they're not talking to anybody at school, and a key worker that's identified. It could be the class teacher, it could be a TA. And the idea is that you work together. It might be 3 times a week, just for 10 minutes in this room. And sometimes I say, Marie, the child could bring in a game that they want. The child feels they're owning the session and they have control of it. And that mum and the child are playing the game, sitting at the table, and we slide the TA in and we're sliding mum out, okay? And it really is graded steps. You're talking about the TA will stand at the door with their back to the child and the mum in the room, and gradually move into the room, sit in the chair, come to the table, turn around. At any point the child stop using their typical voice and tone, you would then backstep, okay? Useful strategies that we've come up with over the years, because the child is very aware of what's going on. And you know, with the new person in the room, we had one girl we worked with who said, oh, she's making notes on me, because the TA had a piece of paper and was pretending to write, so the child wouldn't feel that she was looking or engaging with her. So we thought, oh, that's interesting. What we thought was a good distraction technique actually was causing her more anxiety, because she thought the TA was making notes and assessing her. So we changed it to the TA just reading a book or a magazine. Again, we did that the next session. The child started talking again in a typical voice, and we actually managed to slide the TA from standing at the door with her back to the room to sitting at the table. And the girl, through her mum, said that she wanted the TA to join the game. So it's really little tweaks, really specific, that's done over a period of time. The most successful ones I've worked with is where I'm involved, but very much like as a consultative level. So families that I work with, they will go into school with the TA and do sliding in 3 times a week. But we have a 10-minute phone call before each session, just to talk through the setup of the room, the game that they're playing, what the strategy is for that session. What step did they land on before? Were they sitting at the table? Were they standing? And how we should push it on in that session. And those 10 minutes just before each session has paid off dividends. I was working with a young boy who his teacher and the mum had tried to do the sliding in through the Maggie Johnson, but for 10 minutes before class for about a year. And he's got stuck on a whisper. So he was looking like that at school, but it was causing him great vocal misuse and abuse, because he was just talking on a really hard whisper. And I worked with him. It took about 6 months to undo that. Whereas when you're working with the special speech therapist, those are the kind of things you'll see in my treatment plan. You do not accept a whisper longer than maybe 1 session, because you're constantly wanting to move them on, because it was so hard to undo in this poor boy's voice. was really going, but teachers could hear him, so like, great, we can assess him. His peers could hear him, so he was socialising well. He was right, well, everyone could hear me at school, that's all I need to do. But we worked together for 6 months with his teacher and his TA. It was brilliant. And then I was working in the class as well at the table because we were trying to get him to use his voice. And then that Christmas, he stood up on stage and did the nativity play and spoke 2 lines. And Mum sent me the video, and it was, yeah, it was absolutely amazing. So it's a very emotional therapy working with people with selective mutism, because it's really intense, you know, and it can be really emotional. And especially when I've worked with TAs and teachers who've maybe been with the child for a whole year and they've never heard them speak apart from seeing them on the mum's iPad or the dad's phone at home, and they start talking. It's very special, and it's really rewarding and absolutely great to empower that child. The other thing I'm very strict or direct upon is, like I said, it's 99% the setup for the sliding in session. If any of those factors need to be changed, we do not do the session. So I was working in a nursery near Christmas time, you know what it's like for school plays, it's really busy. And she said, oh, the room that we use, we can't use today, so we need to use another room. And I said, no, we're not going to do the session. We need to keep the factors the same. The only thing that we need to be focusing on is sliding you out and sliding mum out and you in. Okay, we want to keep the room the same, setting the same, you know, the games the child's choosing, the people are the same. That's really important as well. You don't want to keep chopping and changing key worker. It's all about embedding it and setting up. And I would rather not do the session and then wait till the next day when we could be back in the room to push on with it. But yeah, happy to talk more about case studies and think if you want to talk about it afterwards, but it absolutely works. Again, a teacher I work with, she very kindly wrote a review for my website because she said, I just didn't believe it was going to work, that she had 2 in her class, we were working together. I didn't believe it was going to work. You said you were going to come in and support me 3 times a week with this child. He hasn't spoken for 6 months. And then it did work. And she went, I have to write you a review so other teachers can see it, because it does seem like a big investment, and it is, I know, especially in the school timetable, but it should only be for a short period of time. You know, there it says 2 to 3 weeks. Clinically, I've seen between 3 and 6 weeks. You know, it shouldn't be limping on for a whole year. So just to give you some general advice points, okay, just simple bullet points that you can take away with today. You might have a child with selective mutism starting in September, or you've worked with one previously. These are just some really easy tip points to highlight. So when you're talking to the child, provide an explanation rather than discussion. Acknowledge the child's fear of talking. You know, you can own it, help them own it. Let the child know they're not alone. Take the pressure of talking. Explain that talking will get easier. Work on building confidence and building rapport. So really easy. Commentary style of talking. No direct questions. You provide the instructions. Really chatty comments. Give pauses. Ask rhetorical questions. You do all the talking. So to ensure an anxiety-free environment, and again, I'm just signposting you to points in the Maggie Johnson manual, just to break it down for you. So you've got some really clear bits that you can take away with today, but that you know if you want more information, it's all in the resource manual. So always warmly respond to the child's attempt to communicate, even if it's gesture or whispering. Yeah, talk back to them in a natural way, like they've just spoken it to you. Ask the child questions through other adults or children they know, like at home time you might want to speak through mum. Keep a comfortable distance until the child can speak easily in front of you. In private, so maybe in a one-to-one setting in the classroom, if you're doing reading with them, reassure them, say it, vocalize it. I will not single you out to answer a question. I will never make you read out loud, and you won't have to demonstrate an activity unless you want to. This is really, really useful. And I know it's probably you think, well, I wouldn't do that anyway, but a child's activity needs to be told, it needs to be reassured. Even when I come on to transitions, that first week with that child, they need to be told this every single day. I've got a couple of children with selective mutism that love doing show and tell, but they just bring up the item and show it, but will in front of the whole class, and they will do math sums on the board, but they don't want to answer questions, but they've been given that advice all year, so that gave them the confidence to go up and do it. I don't know why it's so jazzy. Okay, so make sure the child has functional things. Can they access the toilet, the lunch hall, drinks, help, first aid without speaking? Yeah, you need to agree a procedure to follow when they feel ill or upset. Something I would always say, you know, have a really small like whiteboard. You can get it for like £1 off Amazon with a pen. And I would say to the child, you know, if you need the toilet, if you need to drink with it, you can draw it, you know, if they're very young, or you can write it and show me. Yeah, immediately you're taking that pressure off them talking, and then they know that they can access their functional needs. I can't tell you how many children I work with Selective Mutism who have just been, you know, are wetting themselves constantly in reception because they are so anxious about talking. All right, so little tools like that, you can write it on a whiteboard, or you can just come and tap me and tell me. You know, like one TA said, oh, it was 2 taps for the toilet, 3 taps they wanted a drink, you know. Let them sit back on the side of the classroom. Yeah, takes that pressure off them for having to feel so central. These are really great. Puppets, masks, voice activated toys, recorded messages, talking tubes, walking talkies. Makes it easier for the child than talking directly. A teacher I was working with last term, she would give the child in her class a talking tile. So the child would go home and record a message for her about her weekend and bring it in and talk about it on the Monday, instead of having to put her hand up in class, which I really loved that. So talking tiles is really great. Always encourage independence, and this will ensure success. So rather than doing things for the child, do things with them and then withdraw, step back, or make it easier. Okay, registration. This is this is a classic one. Allow hands up. You can involve the whole class in a social activity. This one I've seen done loads and it's brilliant. You ask the child's name, the class look round, but they all say it in unison together. That's really useful approach. And a little girl I was working with, her class did it, and within 2 weeks she was mouthing here. So that's a nice one. Let the child know, again, this is confidence building, how well they're doing. You're being so helpful in class, kind, thoughtful, hardworking, good-humoured, brave, creative, all these positive words. Do not confuse a fixed facial expression with glaring defiance, being uninterested or smirking. Don't be hurt or offended if the child remains silent. Do not beg, bribe, persuade or challenge the child to speak or make it your mission to get them to talk. Do not make the child say hello, please, thank you. They're not being rude, and do not ask direct questions which put the child on the spot. All these things are from the Maggie Johnson manual, but I have had to say them to extended family members in home sessions, and I have had to say it in schools. A useful training that I do in schools is for the whole school, because it's not just that key worker and the class teacher the child's working it, is the lunchtime supervisors, the lunch hall people, is that the proper term? The people on reception, yeah, all those people that the child's going to interact with must have this kind of basic understanding of selective mutism and what it is. There, I put it in red to really highlight it. So, transitions. You're working with the child's selective mutism, you've diagnosed it, you've done the treatment, it's being managed within the school environment, and then of course every year there's a change of class, isn't there? And more often than not, a change of teacher, and then sometimes will be a change of school. So a good handover is absolutely essential. Like I talked about with the treatment, 99% of it is actually the setting up of the session. Same with the transition. 99% of it is sorting out the handover. If a good handover is done, it's going to pay off dividends. Must arrange a handover meeting with the speech and language therapist present. We then share the information related to the therapy process and about the child, which is key, and discuss how to approach and work with the child. Coming on to this is just again to signpost you to it as well. Is my child entitled to have an EHC plan if they have selective mutism? So I did a webinar with Amara, a fantastic solicitor that I work with. It's a free webinar. My office details will be at the end. If you contact Gemma, my PA, and she can send you the webinar link for free. It will give you more information about the EHCP process. But just to give you, again, just to empower you with 2 questions, as was set out in case law, 2 questions must be asked. 1, does your child or young person have a learning difficulty or a disability? And 2, is it one that calls for special educational provision? If the answer to both questions is yes, then an EHCP must be issued by the local authority. I do have many children on my caseload alone that have EHCPs at the minute or are currently going through the process. So just to signpost you to that. Resources. So just really clear, we've got the Maggie Johnson Selective Mutism Resource Manual, and then SIMRA is an absolutely amazing association focusing on selective mutism. It discusses information and research. They have a very active Facebook group with a fantastic committee for professionals, parents. I really recommend that you access that, and also they have a website as well. So they're 2 bits just to get you going. We're going to do questions in a minute, and then these are my contact details. So any information, we're going to do questions in a minute. If we want to talk to me a bit more, do feel free to drop me an email, leave a voicemail, and we can get something arranged. Because like I said, today was very much a kind of signposting